Today I'm going to take you through the 120-hour process it took to create Glimmerstone Bakery, and I'm going to break it down in about 25 minutes. I'm starting off with my rough thumbnail sketch, and I've already sunk about 10 hours worth of work into the process at this point as I figured out my composition. I'm working in Procreate on an iPadPro and using Apple Pencil to create this design. I'm using the drawing assist features and the perspective tools, and those are pretty much like a virtual ruler essentially, and it helps me keep my lines and my perspective consistent. I started in early with those truffle balls. Those are like one of my favorite tiny details, and I drew them each individually. Everything in this piece, the process, it's all, by hand. And here is one of the stained glass windows that will be going in the background. Now, sometimes when I'm creating intricate components, I will actually create them in separate files. Here I'm using the symmetry tool. And these were thematic to the bakery. They have kind of a floral and fantasy feel. This one was the dragon window. And you'll see in a moment, I'll pop that right in, and then I'll add the other two windows as well. One of the first things I like to work on in a piece like this is the characters, because if the characters aren't accurate, if they're not right, the piece doesn't really hold together. So I make sure they are almost fully complete very early on. So you're looking at Jessica Ravenwolf. She is my main character from Centernia, and behind her is Paisley May Sarkeesian, and they're both mages. And Glimmerstone Bakery is in Catanzarco City, which is the city of mages. Now, this scene takes place in what I believe will be the fourth Centernia novel. So as of this recording, book 1 and book 2 are already out, and I just received book 3 back from my editors, and they had the suggestion that I break down book 3 into 2 novels, which is why at this point as I'm talking, I sound like I don't know my own books. So like I said, I'm pretty sure this scene will take place in the 4th novel. Okay, jumping back to the recording right there, I am putting in the rug, and just like the stained glass windows, I generated those separately, and then I placed them in, and now you can see I'm adding each of the individual little strands of tassels on the edge of the carpeting. Now, these details are so important because when you are putting a puzzle together and you find a piece that has those fine little lines and you recognize the pattern, it'll make it very easy for you to assemble the rug. So I think about little things like this as I'm creating my puzzles. And there you can see I had a wood texture popping up. I stole that from one of my tables, and I applied it to the ceiling and the frames because I just loved the design. Occasionally I will do that. I will use actual textures, and they're always photos that I have taken, usually for rocks, wood, things like that, things that are, if I was going to use a reference anyways, Oh, here, jumping over to the carpet, the rug in the back. This one has a nautical theme to it because Glimmerstone Bakery is located near the sea. And laying in that carpet and adding in the color. So as I am selecting my color, I am thinking about values. I'm thinking about complementary colors. So for example, Jessie, who's in the purple costume there, it contrasts with the yellow of the room. Okay, and at this point I am adding in the details on that little table in the corner. Yeah, let's zoom in and take a better look. So I'm creating my teapot, but you'll notice before I created the teapot, I created a cube in perspective, and that's what I'm doing with each of the cups, and that helps me, well, basically figure out what's the proper perspective for each of these objects. Adding in this vase. Each of the flowers. I love drawing flowers. They're just so relaxing. Adding in a few more teacups. That flicker that's happening, that's sometimes I'll be like turning layers on and off as I'm working in order to see things better. So that's why you're seeing a flicker. And then I think some of that is just, so Procreate allows me to export the entire drawing process without having to separately record it. Okay, I think at this point, yeah, here we go. I'm working on Mzara, and I don't normally draw old characters. So what I did is I pulled a bunch of references from Google in order to figure out how to draw an elderly character. And then Sarah Ford from Adorka Stock was kind enough to pose for me for the primary pose. So I just basically combined those elements as I created her design. And then I played around quite a bit with her costume to figure out what was the right color. So I started with this creamy color, and then you're going to see in a few moments after I add in the details that I'm going to try like a purpley brown. Okay, just adding in some more detail here. A little more contrast. This is really fun. I don't normally draw elderly characters, so to draw the wrinkles and the sunspots, it's just fun, and I definitely want to draw more characters like her again. So Mzara was not a character in the first two Centernia novels, but she's like super important. I can't wait for you all to read the third book, because you're gonna see her and you're gonna be like, oh my god, it's that character and she's awesome. And it's just spoilers everywhere. Okay, so right here I tried like a purple color because I thought that the purple would contrast with the room, the fact that the background is yellow, so complementary colors. But then I experimented. I think I took the character design into the room, and I was like, this isn't quite right. So then I went back to my creamy color, and I just brightened it up to make kind of white, which references the fact that she's a baker, she's a chef, so I thought that was very appropriate. But because she's also a mage, she has all that gilding and that intricacy to her clothing. Now, it's important to note that in Centernia, the characters don't typically use wands, but when I'm creating a puzzle piece like this and I want to convey to the audience that this is a magic user, using a wand is just the simplest way to visually indicate that. So even though, and maybe mages in Centernia do use focusing wands or sticks or objects like that, but you know, that's just one thing I changed from going between the written story to the visual adaptation. Okay, here I'm creating those cakes, and you'll notice I started with my perspective grids to make sure that the perspective was correct. And I made sure each cake was different, had it different. These were just so much fun. I just love drawing cakes. They're just fun. And you'll know as I placed them, I made sure there were no tangents, being that like they didn't align directly with the windows or the border in the back. They're just slightly off-centered, so they really come forward and they pop. And the colors used are really saturated, in contrast to, even though the room is yellow, it's kind of a yellow-gray. It's kind of dull. There I am adding a cake bag and then the little piping. I love cake decorating in real life. I love it. I love doing, my mom taught me the Wilton method when I was a teenager, and I still like using it for cakes. So just bringing that into my art. Oh, okay, this guy in the background. Okay, so I created him on a separate file. So even though he's going to be super tiny, I just wanted to get the expression right. And this is another one that Sarah Ford did an awesome. She was my model, and she was just fantastic with her expression for this. Here I'm creating the character. So I wanted because he works in this bakery, I wanted his costume to kind of reflect Zara's. So white with that gold in the center, but it's not nearly as fancy as hers because she is the head baker and he's just basically a grunt. And he does appear in the 3rd Centernia book. Might be the 4th, depending on how So right now, as of this recording, I'm in the process of taking the 3rd Centernia novel and taking my editor's recommendation and splitting it into 2 novels. So I'm going through that process at the moment. So that's why I sound like I don't know what I'm talking about my own book. Okay, this guy is just about done. Adding just a few more details. And I'm thinking about the light source and how he would fit into the bakery. Okay, at this point I'm going to pop him in and there he goes. There he is. All that work for this tiny background character. And making another vase with some pretty flowers. I just want to go to this bakery so bad. Okay, let's fix the floor. And adding in my little dragonettes. Cleaning up these areas as I try to figure out the perspective of the dragons. And once again, you see how I'm drawing my cubes to figure out what would be the proper angle. Now, this is going to become a candy jar. As I'm working, I'm always thinking about my light source. And these cupcakes. People often ask me how I select my color palettes, and to be honest with you, I just pick colors that I'm drawn to. I tend to really enjoy working with very saturated colors, but as I'm working, there's still some underlying principles. Like often in the shadows, using a complementary color. I'm working things the same way as if I was doing pastel or watercolor. I think about reflected light. I think about the overall lighting and mood of the room. But then when I'm doing a puzzle piece, I'm also thinking, how can I contrast my colors and give the puzzler a variety of color to work with. As I'm working along, so normally I'm on my iPadPro, but then occasionally I will bring the art onto my computer monitor, and sometimes I will even project it onto my TV screen because that's the easiest way for me to see the puzzle in the scale that it will be printed at, because usually puzzles are roughly, at least the ones I do, are usually around 30 inches, sometimes more. And it's important for me to get an idea of the scale. And then I'll also usually lay a grid down on it towards the end of the puzzle design, and that helps me know, and it's like usually a 1-inch grid, so I can make sure like every component has something interesting. Oh, this is the dragon cake. This one I asked my daughter, I'm like, what should I draw? What should the cakes be like? And she's like, dragons and strawberries. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I will make a strawberry dragon cake. Adding in more cake. And then this interesting curly structure here. I needed something to visually break up that floor, because it was just, I knew when it came to the puzzle companies, they don't like areas that are just too much of the same color, which is another reason I tend to use rainbows. Oh, speaking of rainbows, here are the rainbow cakes being created. You see how I started with my perspective grid and then built those in, thinking about the light and shadow. But anyways, with that little curvy, swervy thing, the thing that eventually it became like basically a holder for some different candies. A lot of times in my puzzles, I will use butterflies to break things up. And even though this puzzle, you'll see towards the end, I do add a few butterflies, I didn't want to have a ton of insects, and I couldn't use insects and birds and things like that because it is a bakery. I wanted it to be a clean environment. You'll see there are a few cats and just a few tiny mice, but I didn't want them to overwhelm the space as they often do in some of my other works. Oh, here making those chocolate critters, chocolate owls. Oh, these were just so much fun. And the sprinkle jars. That was another thing when I asked my daughter. I was like, okay, what does this bakery need? She's like, sprinkles, lots of sprinkles. And I hand drew each and every one of those sprinkles. And then you'll see in a moment, I basically took the layer and replicated it and then altered the colors and made it so it wasn't such an obvious pattern. Here are the other sprinkles. And see, I individually draw most of those sprinkles. Oh, you'll notice in the background, I will be honest, that is the skyline of New York in the window in the background because there are elements of, Centernia is tied to Earth via gates, and I love having those little Earth elements sneaking through in places that you don't expect to see them. So it's like the mystical city of New York in this bakery in the magical land of Centernia. More cupcakes. I think these are the fruit cupcakes. I did like an individual candied fruit on each one. Yep, there we go. Each one different, each one unique. So once again, as you're assembling this puzzle, if you'll get the pattern of what belongs where in the image, but yet there'll be something distinctly different. So you'll be able to figure out where they fall. Oh, and those are those glass bottles. When I painted Twilight Marketplace, I spent a good couple hours just studying how to draw glass, how light reflects through glass, and just like how to make these jars. So I got kind of addicted to the process. So as I was creating these, I wanted to bring in some more of those bottles as well, just so I could draw them again because they're fun. They're one of those things that glass in general is something that looks hard when you're first trying to draw it. But once you break it down and figure out the rules and of how things reflect and what bounces the light and where there's like a sweet spot, once you figure this pattern out, then it becomes easy. And here's another sprinkle jar. So in the beginning of this video, I talked about how I had already put in 10 hours worth of sketching before I got to this point. And that's my process for all of my puzzles. I really come up with the exact composition and I figure out where everything is going to go. So like, for example, with this, like I knew it was going to be a table full of stuff, and the stuff was going to be candies and cookies and pastries and some little dragons. I didn't know where exactly they were going to go, but I roughly knew what I was going to put there. And then when I go and I'm painting over the sketch, I just dive right in. And usually when I put something down, that's where it stays. Occasionally you'll see me shifting things around. But for the most part, when I'm at this phase of the illustration, I just work straight through. Usually at this point, I'm listening to audiobooks or podcasts, and it's kind of funny because when I look at individual elements of the images, sometimes in my mind, I could hear the podcast or audiobook that I was listening to at the time, and sometimes right down to the specific scene. So I have weird contrasting connotations. So when I was working on this one, I was listening to Sarah J. Maas's Court of Thorns and Roses series, which is absolutely beautiful. So I have like that going through my head as I'm drawing each of these individual little pastries. So here you could see the bakery is approaching completion. I added some butterflies. Honestly, I have a separate file where I just have tons of butterflies already drawn. And some of them I will reuse throughout my puzzles. Oh, these little pumpkin things were fun. I think I created like one or two and then I just replicated them, and I used the hue saturation shift in order to change the color. And then I slightly manipulated each of the angles, creating that little dragon. Oh yeah, I gave him a lollipop. I really struggled with these creatures for this specific piece because I didn't want it to be gross. I was thinking of the reality of what would it be like to have a dragon in a shop like this. I had considered adding flying cats and some of the other critters that I often have in my pieces, but the dragons just seemed more clean, I guess, and magical and sentient and more acceptable to have in an environment like this, which is why I chose to add dragons prominently in the foreground. Oh, and then you can see I also added the little lizards. Oh, this is my chocolate syrup bottle. This was another thing that I asked my daughter. I'm like, what should I put in this bakery? And she's like, chocolate syrup. So I'm like, okay, how do I draw kind of like a Hershey's syrup bottle, but without stepping on any copyright thing? So I just made a generic brown bottle and added some rainbow elements. Something that, you know, it's recognizable, but not recognizable at the same time. Oh, there I added a few more butterflies and then adjustments. So like that dragon that I'm working on there in the foreground, like there is a lot of conscious choices that are going on. The fact that the dragon is that bold blue and his head overlaps with the orange of the rug, because there we go, playing the complementary colors and the contrast and allowing that dragon to really come forward and be prominent to the viewer. Okay, there I am adding a few more candies in the tray. Okay, at this point I think I'm just working some fine little details. And I must be well past like 115 hours at this point in the drawing. I don't know how. Sometimes I'm asked how I'm this patient. And it's just, you know, I dive into the process. I trust the process and I just keep drawing until I get to the end, which I think we're at right now. So there you have it. This is the finished Glimmerstone Bakery.